Misha here, and last time we were looking at the Star Wars Micro Galaxy Squadron we looked at the clone fighters. This time we have a good number more to check out because we're going to check out the TIE fighters. Really from beginning to end. And they've done a really good job of representing nearly all of them. I don't think anyone's ever going to get every single variant because there are some very obscure ones. And there are some that are just newly coming out. But we have all the main ones from the original trilogy. And some expanded universe that have made it in to canon. And as usual, I'll kind of give my interpretation because it's all fiction anyway. So some of the stuff I will mess around with just because, yeah, fiction. So with no further ado, we're actually going to need to go back further and talk about how the TIE came to be. And can I pick up where we left off last time with the Imperial V-Wing here. We spent enough time talking about the V-Wing in the earlier video. This is the Imperial version, and it was intended to be a transitional step. Even though these are not solar arrays, they do kind of form that silhouette. It is a relatively light, relatively disposable non-hyperdrive craft, although it could dock to a ring, and it did not have life support inside. And it too was powered by twin ion engines, very similar to what would be in the TIE LN. Of course, the TIE would never have a droid because that was mostly there in case a hyperdrive ring was needed, and also the wings here kind of folded up for landing and the like, including a front landing gear pad thing. Folded around like this because he's operated from carriers as well as ground installations. Of course, another early influence more in the cockpit layout was the ETA-2 Actus class Interceptor used by the Jedi and also by skilled clone pilots. This really kind of set the trend for being small but powerful, and also has the look. These are both from Senior Fleet Systems, which is where we pick up with our first TIE. And before talking TIEs, we have to at least mention the pilot themselves, partially because half the system's gear is on them, at least the life support. Not going to go too deep in, but they were considered elites. They started off as leftover clones. They really did just evolve out of the clone pilot corps. And that sense of both being very expendable but also very elite kind of carried over. And they would be trained in the hundreds of thousands and then eventually millions at various academies from Coruscant to Rothral and other Outer Rim areas. And each pilot would not really specialize, but they would be trained, cross-trained I guess is the right word, in pretty much every single and two-seat craft of the TIE twin ion engine series. And they also knew how to do basic mechanical work and whatnot. And well, training was pretty intense. Took a couple of years, with some of that being in the field to make sure if you washed out you might become a gunner. They were part of the Navy, although the Army themselves did have some pilots. That's where you get the vac heads and warthogs, or groundhog division. This of course is a Black Series black guy, and this is a 1/12 scale. But they would pretty much wear the full suit even if their craft had life support, just as a backup. And they would carry a sidearm, emergency beacon, but not a whole lot else on their person. On board ship, they would just wear a regular uniform. Yeah, these were the guys who flew the ties and were rather proud of it, and they did celebrate their skill. Just for comparison, here is one of the micro figures in 1/72 scale, and he really is more or less an inch tall with basic articulation just to sit down and put his hands on the controls. Pretty well detailed for the small scale. I mean, they did a probably better job, I would say, than Hobby Master did with their little pilot figures, and certainly paint app-wise. So with that, let's get into the TIE itself. Here it is, your base Imperial Starfighter. Work began during the Clone Wars, and this really is an evolution of what we saw before, especially the technology packaged inside. But things like the V-Wing, the B-19, the ARC 170, they were created for a different type of war. Carrier on carrier, fighter on fighter, droids versus clones. After the Empire came to be, they needed something more for patrol, anti-piracy, anti-smuggling, almost more of a police force, because the rebellion really would not appear outside of just isolated CIS pockets for about a decade, and it would not really get heavily organized for almost 2. So, ship-to-ship, fighter-to-fighter combat wasn't the common norm. However, the Empire had an entire galaxy to control, so they needed sturdy yet inexpensive and very uniform, very standard spacecraft that could be launched from various sized ships. Yeah, Star Destroyers get all the glory, but cruisers and corvettes and things are really what you need for the Outer Rim. So, Sinar Fleet Systems developed the twin ion engine fighter, the TIE LN for line fighter, and this is your base version here, seen in pretty much every Imperial action beginning around 18 BBY, although it would take to about 10 BBY before all the older aircraft and spacecraft were fully, taken out of service. What do we have here? The central ball chassis is titanium, with the solar arrays, solar collectors, being a type of hardened quadranium steel. And yes, it does collect solar energy. Then it has a reactor converter, and that typically powers the engines and the sensor systems. The laser cannon, which we have 2 LS1 laser cannon, typically have a secondary power source, or at least power supply, so that they won't run out, that you can run the engines and cannon at the same time. It is deceptively simple, no life support, no shields, and whereas the V-Wing had no hyperdrive either, it could dock with the ring. This was never intended to dock with the ring. In fact, it was never intended to land on landing gear, although in a pinch it could land on its arrays, wings, foils, whatever you want to call them. But that really wasn't what it was meant for. It was meant to live in space, and while it could dive into an atmosphere, it wasn't just super great at atmospheric flying. I mean, there's not really much aerodynamics to it. In an atmosphere, it was capable of about 1200 kph. In space, it was about 100 megalights. It was durable, dependable, easily to mass produce. These engines, while simple, the twin ion engines, are very advanced for what they were, and they were very power efficient. That's why it was able to operate on solar energy. It also had 2 ion thrusters that acted like repulsors too. The laser cannons were quite powerful for its small size, and it had 2 reasonably powerful short to medium range sensor arrays, again for the kind of smuggling, piracy, patrol, policing duties, certainly more so than the V-Wing. It was quite maneuverable, quite speedy, and the arrays did kind of allow for a degree of protection too. Illustrating that, the so-called battle damage version, but they did give some protection on the side. Again, they were made out of a hardened steel. It could take a hit or two, but that's about it. It used speed, agility, and frankly, just mass use. It was never alone, or at least that wasn't the theory. Typically, a squadron would have 12 TIEs, and a full assault or attack group would have 6 squadrons. So full strength was 72 TIEs. And again, the pilots were well trained, even if they were sometimes called coffin jockeys, and these were kind of seen as death traps. It wasn't like they were just dropped into them with no training. And they did celebrate their skill, and they were considered higher up on the food chain compared to stormtroopers, which themselves were considered higher up than the regular Imperial Army. There was also a rivalry between the Imperial Navy pilots and the Imperial Army pilots, which we'll talk about in a minute more. Back here we have the engine compartment. They're easy to maintain, easy to repair. They're very standardized. In fact, pilots would routinely rotate crafts so they did not get attached to one or kind of familiar with just one over the other and its quirks. No, the idea was standardization. Each pilot could pick up any TIE and take it into battle and be equally good. They used alphanumeric call signs. They didn't use, names, at least officially, although unofficially it would come into use because even though the first pilots were clones and leftover veterans of the Clone Wars, by 18 BBY they started training just recruits, and that would continue on for quite some time. All the TIE pilots were officers, of course, not enlisted. That's just kind of how it works. So this was the norm, the standard, and in the beginning it's what was fielded, and that let other specialized craft like the ARC 170 hang on a few years more because the TIE had its limitations, but it made up for it in the fact that they could just crank these out. They were easy to keep going and inexpensive if they were lost. One of these costs less than a V-Wing, V-19, any previous craft, around 60,000 credits new. And they were all made by CNR Fleet Systems and their subsidiaries across the galaxy. But as soon as they kind of perfected the technology here, they started branching out and specializing. The first variant to appear, and they got their money's worth out of it, was the TIE SA for surface attack, but we know it as the TIE Bomber. Work began shortly after the introduction of the TIE LN, and these started to appear in 15 BBY is a specialist, although modular craft. The original TIE here is about 6.5 meters by 6.5 meters by 7.5 meters, just roughly speaking. This has rather different dimensions. It's just under 8 meters long and around 9 meters wide, but it's shorter at just about 5 meters tall. Part of that is because of its bent wings or solar arrays, and that was to A, give it a little lower profile, and B, give it a little better performance in an atmosphere. While these definitely operated in space, for the first time they were thought of as, needing to go in atmosphere more than not. In that instance, it was to make them a little more aerodynamic and give them a little better speed and a little better maneuverability because it needed all the help it could get. These were developed to kind of hit hardened targets, remaining separatist holdouts, rebel pirate strongholds, and go up against any kind of capital ship that the Empire might need to go after. And typically they would be escorted because they weren't a great fighter as such, although Thrawn did demonstrate they could be used in the pinch by at least a skilled pilot. We again have a titanium hull with a type of hardened steel armor. So it actually has a little thicker, a little chunkier armor compared with the regular one. And we have 2 ion engine arrays again. And these are larger, more powerful versions, because this thing can haul up to 15 metric tons of cargo, supplies, or personnel depending on the configuration. No shields, no hyperdrive. Some versions would have life support, if not all. As far as lasers, it still had 2 of the LS-1 cannon up here, but those are really just as a last resort because it was, well, a bomber. And we have a crew of 2 in here, a pilot and a bombardier or otherwise specialist. The second seat could also be used as a ad hoc transport if needed in emergency as well. Like the regular TIE, it carried about 2 days of provisions in a pinch. So most of your systems are on this pod. We have quite an advanced sensor suite, and we have a targeting computer, targeting system, a bomb sight as you will. Much more electronics and avionics there. That's all in this pod. And then in this pod, in addition to the engine, we have the kind of primary purpose of this craft right here. The standard TB had a bomb bay, or rather a 2-section bay. In the front here, we have dual ordnance launchers. These could carry a standard load of 4 proton torpedoes each, although a lot of times pilots would fit in 6 per launcher for a total of 12. Alternatively, they could carry up to 16 concussion missiles or other ordnance. They would launch out the front. But then here, in the rear part, we have a true bomb chute down here. And those would typically have proton bombs. They could carry, a few of those, or if they really wanted to, you could carry 60 or 70 thermal detonators and drop them out to really just bombard a surface with small but mini explosions. So we have 2 basic methods of delivering ordnance, kind of powered, guided from the front, or more or less free fall out the bottom, although some of those would have basically guidance engines too. And that's really where the second guy would come in to play, was be working with those, freeing up the pilot to try to keep this thing from being shot out of the sky. Despite its additional armor and powerful engines, it only could hit about 90 megalights in space, or 850, 900 kph in an atmosphere. It was technically faster than a Y-wing, but the Y-wing had hyperdrive and shields. This did not. It could definitely take more hits than a regular TIE, but you wouldn't want to risk it more than 4 or 5, maybe 6 laser hits, depending on the power rating. Nevertheless, these are popular. They cost more to build than a TIE fighter, of course, but the Empire got its money's worth. They were still cheaper than an ARC 170, and they could adapt them too, because this pod on the port side is modular. There are a few different main versions. For example, there's the TIE BR, the TIE boarding craft. The pod is replaced with a passenger pod holding typically 6 stormtroopers, although you could cram in more if you really had to. And instead of an ordnance launcher in the front, it had a docking port with a cutting beam, so it could come up and hit a enemy vessel or station and cut its way in, as we saw with the Tantive 4 invader in the 501st. Another version was the TIE SH, TIE Shuttle, where this pod was replaced with a little bit better appointment, usually 4 to 6 people, and slightly more comfort. And not really geared for boarding, but just transporting, especially interfleet or down to the surface of a planet. And on those, they would actually reverse the solar collectors, the wings, so they would point outwards, probably just making docking and berthing easier. And there are some other minor variations and adaptations, but those are the three main ones, with the TIE SA, the TIE bomber here, being really the mainstay of the fleet for any kind of heavy ordnance duty, because even though it really did require an escort, it could deliver pretty much any ordnance with a total of 3 different launch systems, 2 in the front, 1 below. And 15 tons, that's pretty good payload, all things considered. The pilots would be essentially the same, although they would get slightly different helmets with different goggles and different interfaces just to make it targeting a little better for them. So these were the 2 main ties of the fleet in the beginning, and they pretty much allowed for all the Clone War era starfighters to be retired, although there's still a bit of a gap we need to fill. The regular TIE LN was just a good workaday fighter for your average pilot. The bomber, good for space or surface assaults or armored transport if need be. Quite a versatile craft, and economical at that. But what about pilots that flew things like the ETA-2, the Actus, and kind of other high performance? Well, there was a need, and this would fill it. The TIE Interceptor, the TIE IN. Now, design on this would not really start until there was a bit of a need for a higher performance starfighter, as rebel cells would kind of start to pop up more and more, like Saw Gerreras and stuff. So around 10.9 BBY work would begin, and there'd be limited production well before major events like Scarif and Yavin, but really production would be increased after the loss of the first Death Star, and the idea was to actually replace most of the TIE LNs that would potentially see rebel combat with this craft. So by the time of the Battle of Endor in 3 to 4 BBY, these consisted of about 20 to 25% of the frontline Imperial fleet. So they didn't get around to replacing all the TIE LNs, but it's a pretty good effort when you consider just how many they had. And it was a very economical choice. Senior Fleet Systems, of course, designed and produced this. It only cost about 15 or 20,000 credits more than a regular TIE. And you did get pretty good bang for your buck. First off, while its basic composition, titanium, hardened steel, is the same, the armor is a little thickened. We do have larger solar collectors, solar arrays. They are slanted in for better performance in an atmosphere and just to kind of lower the profile. Overall, it's about 11.5 meters long thanks to how these stick out so far. About 8 meters wide, so not quite as wide as the bomber. And about 7 meters tall, so just a little bit shorter than your regular TIE here. Maybe 6.5 meters. There you go, comparison. Still had 1 pilot, no life support, nothing like that. It used the same twin ion engines with twin ion thrusters, but they were uprated. It had a more advanced sensor suite, and more importantly, it had a true targeting computer system. 2 of them. That's what's in here in the arrays. So much better detection, targeting, auto systems there. But where it really came into play was its speed, agility, and offensive firepower. When you think of the TIE Interceptor, you definitely think of its speed. And outside of things like the Rebel A-Wing, it was faster than just about anything else fueled it in numbers. It had a space of about 110 megalights. In an atmosphere, it was about 1250, 1300 kph. So, not just a super step up from the regular TIE, but, noticeably so, a good 10% increase. It was also just more agile, and it had much greater firepower, which is why we need the extra energy collection. Standard loadout were 4 laser cannon on the wingtips, and these are an improved version too. This is the LS 9.3 version. It's an uprated, more energy efficient, but also harder hitting version of the LS1. And for special needs, if the mission required it, 2 more additional lasers could be fitted in the ball. I would assume these are still LS1s though, so it could deliver a frontal assault of up to 6 laser blasts at once, although most again just had 4. If the assault need, and especially if it was a short range mission where it could have a secondary kind of power cell inside. So it had some flexibility, some versatility, but really it just improved on the TIE in every way, and was typically given to elite, special, or gifted pilots because, with the extra oomph and power, it did require more control. But you saw a lot of guards, like the Imperial Guards, flying these, and they were assigned to defend the second Death Star. Did a great job there, guys. But just like the regular TIE, it really wasn't meant to land anywhere, although it could on its wings if it had to, but typically it would dock in the bay just like a TIE would. And so these 3 really were the mainstay, the most mass-produced TIEs in the fleet, and generally speaking they kind of covered all bases among them, operating from carrier type craft. So what do we have here? Well, the central, fantastic.